بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Is on? Yeah. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we ask Allah puts barakah and guidance in our gathering together. And we thank and praise Him for the opportunity to be in the house of Allah and having prayed Salatul Isha in the house of Allah on this night. We began last week by speaking at the beginning, if you remember, about the discourse concerning space. And I thought that was quite important that we think about our lives as Muslims and how Allah in the Qur'an, He speaks about different like dimensions of space, sometimes within a single setting, sometimes within different settings, in the way of like the way you think about transitioning through space. Allah in the Quran, we spoke about last week, one example we considered was the examples of people in the Quran who lived in a particular space, and even though they had, and I think this was in the context of hijrah, of migrating through space. And there could be a situation where a people or a person finds himself in physical difficulty, unable to practice his religion, in which case hijrah becomes warranted upon him. Or a person finds himself in a place there is freedom to practice his religion, but because of the maghrumat al-hayat, because of the affairs of the life, where there is shahawat and indecencies and things, he's unable to control his desires. He therefore migrates from a place and a space that is physically good because he's protected physically in the space, but his heart is at risk in that space, and therefore he can make a migration like that. Allah in the Quran, Surah Al-Tahrim, speaks about people who are in small, like you might think about like domestic spaces. In one example, the wives of Nuh and Lut alayhim salam. And Allah says they were in that space, but they فَخَانَتَهُمَا, but they disbelieved, and they were of the kafirin, and they enter hell, amongst those who enter hell. And then you have in the next verse the example of the wife of Fir'aun, again finding herself in a space of disbelief, of kufr, but she finds iman and faith in that small space. And so therefore the way that we manage ourselves through space, one is predicated on the physical essence of our very being. You could be physically at risk, physically harmed, or you could find yourself in a place where you are physically free, but you're emotionally or spiritually harmed in light of practicing your religion. And then we spoke about transitioning through space and places, with like the example of Sulaiman alayhi salam in the Quran. وَحُشِرَ سُلَيْمَانُ جُنُودُهُ مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ وَالطَّيْرِ هُمْ يُوزَعُونَ. Allah says, gathered before Sulaiman alayhi salam were his armies of human, jinn and birds, and they're all arranged. And this is a temporal space, but it's a temporal space of power and might. And so Sulaiman alayhi salam, he has his army all arranged before him. حتى إذا أتوا على واد النمل, until they come to the valley of the ants. And the valley is adna, the valley is low, it's a low place. It's not the same place and space as we found ourselves in the previous ayah, when Sulaiman alayhi salam is before in this great presence of might and power and his army. Now it's about like nothingness, because there's this naml. Also interesting, by the way, in this ayah is the fact, number one, it's in Surah An-Naml, it's in the surah called the ants, and Allah mentions ants 3 times in this one verse. وَادِ النَّمْلِ قَالَتْ نَمْلَةٌ يَيُّهَا النَّمْلِ O ants. And Allah is reinforcing, therefore, there's a space that belongs, number one, to the ants, because they say أُدْخُلُوا مَسَاكِنَكُمْ, enter your homes, as opposed to enter your like houses, dar manzil bayt, which gives us also the impression, because remember the masakin, maskan is from sakan, sakina, all of these words are interconnected, and that's the place you find peace in, warmth in. Allah in the Quran says, وَمِنْ آيَاتٍ خَلَقَ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Allah says, from the ayah about marriage in Surah Al-Rum, that from the signs of Allah you will find is placed between, created for you, from you, your mates and partners, so you can find peace in them. tranquility, repose, warmth. I mean, that's what makes a home into a house, having the sense of homeliness or warmth and love. That's a beautiful thing for us to think about. The Prophet said that on people who are, if you hear the iqamah being called, he says, don't run to the masjid, wa alaykum as-sakina, and upon you should be peace. You should be in a state of peacefulness. And so the ants, therefore, they have the same thing. They're creation of Allah, and they find themselves in a place that's homely for them. And it's also the queen, female ant that's speaking, and therefore that's also authority, power, leadership. All of these things are there. And so it's interesting if you think about that in terms of transitioning through space. But the bulk of our discourse last week was about the first migration of the Prophet's companions to Al-Habash, to Abyssinia. And we spoke about the reasons for this migration. And this concerned moving away from a land to another land to find safety and peace, to practice their religion. Sahaba, the early ones who migrated, 11 from the men, 4 from the women, were not all those who had protectorates in Mecca like other Sahaba they did. And even though things were tough, it couldn't reach the extent of really extreme physical abuse, because there was still an area of protecting allies of the tribes, and that was still there. In fact, that's something that even Salama says concerning the Prophet ﷺ, that wa'udhiya, they suffered, and the Prophet wasn't able to protect them. And he also had, of course, at that time, the protection of Abu Talib at that time, so that was something that our Prophet had, ﷺ. In any case, they migrated, and the migration was from Mecca to Abyssinia. Now, one of the wisdoms behind that journey was determined by the Prophet's statement to them when he says, "Inna fil ard al-Habasha malikan la yuzlam ahadan indahu." There is in the land of Abyssinia, al-Habasha, a king, and nobody is wronged with him, meaning in his land. فَالْحَقُوا بِبِلَادِهِ, and so go to his land, حَتَّى يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ فَرْجًا وَمَخْرَجًا مِمَّا أَنْتُمْ فِيهِ, until Allah takes you out of the difficulties and the constraints that you're in and gives you relief and freedom from what you're finding yourself in now. And that's, of course, Allah in the Qur'an says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ, that in the Rasulullah Rasul min anfusikum, from you, azizun alayhi ma anittum, it really troubles him. He's full of harisun alaykum, full of concern for you, troubles him what's going to happen to you in dunya and akhirah. And for the believers, he's full of compassion and mercy. And this was his concern and care and mercy for his companions, to go to a place they could find some relief. And so therefore, that's the first thing, that they went based upon that divine guidance of the Prophet ﷺ as an instruction for them. Number 2, there was already an awareness about Abyssinia because of trade, and so they were aware of, it wasn't like going to a very far off land that they had no knowledge of. They were aware of Abyssinia because of trade relations and trading between the Meccans and the Abyssinians. Number 3, it wasn't extremely far, because they had to go from the port of Jeddah and then by ship, and so they could reach Abyssinia, in a matter of a few days perhaps. It wasn't extremely far, like going to a very, very distant land where there'd be no communication and no knowledge at all. And so these kind of reasons in place, they made the migration to Abyssinia. And when they're there, if you remember, we spoke about how Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who was the emir in one instance, was the one in dialogue with the Najashi, the king Ashama. His name was Ashama, and he was a Christian, and he had his entourage of Christian bishops who were with him. And when he went, and there was an exchange, and then he gave him free passage and free, to live in the land of Abyssinia with freedom and not to be harmed. And then the Mushrikeen, they sent their people, Amr ibn al-As, was sent, and he said to the king that these people are rebels, renegades, running away from us, and send them back to our country so we can deal with them with justice. And he refused because he heard then the appeal of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and he was moved by that. And then the next day they went again, and then he gave him the da'wah to Islam and the verses from the Qur'an, Surah Maryam. And then it says in the books of Sirah and Tafsir that the king began to cry and weep, and his bishops began to weep, and the Bibles were full of like tears, and the beds were soaking with tears, and they were moved by the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then they were given free passage. Now, we spoke about what happened, and so the most that's related about the migration is coming from Salama radiallahu anha, who ends up being the wife of the Prophet himself after the death of Abu Salama radiallahu anha. And so she's telling us the most about Abyssinia. We also have the hadith of Asma bint Umays radiallahu anha. This is, I think we discussed last week when Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab went to the home of his daughter Hafsa, and Asma bint Umays was there, and he said, Habashiyatu hadihi, Bahriyatu hadihi, is this the one who went on the ship? Is this the one who went to Abyssinia? And she said, Na'am, yes. And he said, Nahnu ahaq, we are more deserving of the Prophet ﷺ than you, because we migrated from Mecca to Medina. And she was very angry, and then she went and said, Ya Rasulullah, this is what Umar is saying. In fact, she said, Wallahi la, I won't eat anything or drink anything until I've told the Prophet what you just said to me. Full of, because she had a sense of pride in the sense that they made a big sacrifice. She says, we were in the land, Bu'ada wal Baghada, we were in a distant, far land and a hated land. I mean, they didn't like to be there. And for sure they would have had homesickness leaving Mecca and then going to Abyssinia. New land, new culture, new language. They couldn't speak the language. They didn't speak the language. New food, new diets, new climate, culture, all of these things. And we were far. And he says, you were with the Prophet and he was, and he's teaching your ignorant ones and feeding your hungry ones. And we didn't have anything like that. So she really felt offended, and so she said, this is what he's saying, Ya Rasulullah. And he said, did he really say that? And he said, yeah. And she said, and he says, no. He says, وَلَهُ وَلِأَصْحَابِهِ هِجْرَةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ وَلَكُمْ أَنْتُمْ أَهْلَ السَّفِينَ هِجْرَةً. Him and his people have one migration. You people of the boat, you have two migrations. And it was a way of like consoling us that theirs was a great sacrifice and a great struggle. And the first immigrants were these people. And that is, of course, to their credit, And so that's from Asma bint Umays. But the ones coming from Salama are very positive, in fact, about the experience in Abyssinia. That we were at peace, we weren't harmed. She said that there was no zulm, no injustice on us. Now, although in its brevity, because remember that the second group were there for about 15 years, came when Khaybar, when they were in Medina. That's many years after the Prophet's migration himself. And so imagine being in a land for 14, 15 years. It's not like being 14 months. There's a lot to say, but what is said is not that much. Except the impression we get from Salama's narrations is that it was a positive being there. Now we kind of had to cut short last week because of time, but one of the things was about the lessons that we take from Muslims living as a minority in Abyssinia. Remember that they're in Abyssinia, but they still have connection to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's one of the first things we spoke about, what makes a new existence in a new land manageable. Yeah, I was reading Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, he survived Auschwitz. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's a very famous book, sold millions of copies in the world. He survived, and he devised a thing called logotherapy. It's just a term. Logotherapy means surviving through suffering, like search for meaning, man's purpose through suffering. And he's speaking about life in the camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau, how things were difficult, how terrible and sad they were, bad they were, but how they coped in that situation. And he speaks about, one of the things he says about logotherapy is that we find ourselves in a camp, and he says in his memoir, he says, what I found is that people who had a willingness to lived. People who had a willingness to live, their bodies just kind of had the coping mechanisms to live. And those who lost hope in the beginning and lost faith and had no what would you say, eagerness, to get back home, are the ones their bodies just didn't, and Allah knows best, But it's an interesting way of looking at it, because there is, of course, some sense of resolve we do feel when we're looking forward to things. Allah in the Qur'an says, Surah Al-Duha, وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. The mushrikeen was saying, وَدَّعَهُ رَبَّهُ وَدَّعَهُ رَبَّهُ وَدَّعَهُ رَبَّهُ. His Lord has abandoned him. And Allah says, وَمَا وَضَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى. Your Lord hasn't abandoned nor scorned you. Then Allah says, وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. And what is coming ahead of you is better than what is with you. And that, of course, is hope generating. Right? And Allah is saying, وَالضُّحَى, by the early morning brightness. وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى. Sajah means, the Mufassirin, they say, إِذَا كَانَ سَاكِرًا كَمَا يَكُونَ سَكُونَ الْبَحَرِ. When the night is still like the stillness of the sea, right? That's hope generating, because there was a delay in the revelation when Surah Duha was revealed after 6 months after the first revelation. And so, looking forward for tomorrow's day gives us a lot of hope, because it could be that tomorrow is better than what you have today. Otherwise, we'll just all lose hope and think that tomorrow is going to be as sad as it is today. But it could be that Allah changes situations, and of course Allah changes situations immediately. I was speaking yesterday in the khutbah about this terrible terrorist, what he did in New Zealand. I said, so obviously, you think to yourself, hey, you have this sadistic criminal terrorist who's planning to murder these innocent musallin in the masjid. And there you have the musallin planning and preparing to go to the house of Allah. And both of them are making a preparation. One's preparing to commit murder, others preparing to pray to Allah in the house of Allah. And I was telling my wife, I was saying, look, there is one hadith, the ulama have almost like ijma, almost consensus amongst them that this is a hadith speaking about fada'il, about the virtues of deeds. And the one that seems to always come at the top is the hadith when the Prophet said that, so authentic hadith about the one who prepares himself for Jum'ah. He has a shower, he cleans himself, and he goes early to the house of Allah for Jum'ah. And he prays and he sits at the front waiting for the Imam to appear. And the Prophet says, for every step he takes, he has 1 year of fasting and 1 year of Qiyam al-Layl. For every step. And the ulama, they say there is no hadith that has there's a more potential of reward like this hadith is saying. And I said to myself, subhanAllah, imagine, because maybe these were the early ones that he gunned down. The early ones, the sabiqun, al-awwalun, they were the first ones there, and he killed them. And they were the ones that, subhanAllah, Allah give them firdaus al-a'la, and shuhada, But you do think, you think about that. And so, what was I saying? I was saying something. So they're both making these preparations. One preparing for the murder, and the other's preparing for being in the house of Allah and praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what this reflects, in this case, is that you have a person intent on the murder. Now, one of the things about being in Abyssinia is that whenever you're a minority, you're always at risk. There's always a risk factor. And so that existed, of course, for the Muslims of Abyssinia as it existed for the Muslimin today in New Zealand. As a minority, the full degree of protection and safety isn't always going to be there. As a minority, you don't have the Islamic government over you, tending for you. You don't have that privilege. But it doesn't mean you don't have some degree of justice. This is what our Prophet is saying about Abyssinia. Go there because there is a king and nobody is wronged with him. That means that can exist even with the non-Muslims. We have other examples in the Prophet's life, like non-Muslims but who did a lot of goodness that our Prophet paid tribute to, like Mut'im ibn Adi was one of them. the man who was the one who gave the Prophet safe passage back into Mecca, and during the boycott used to send caravans of food along with Abu Talib, to feed the Prophet, and he was of the mushrikeen, and he died upon shirk at his own loss, but then he had that, and so in the Battle of Badr, when the 70 prisoners of war were there, and the Sahaba looked at them, and the Prophet says to them, لو كان مطعم ibn Adi حيا, if Mut'im ibn Adi was alive today, and he asked me about these 70 filthy prisoners, لَتَرَكْتُهُمْ لَهُ, I would release all of them for him. And even though he was a mushrik and he died as a mushrik, but it was in terms of paying back what the goodness that he did. And the same is like Abu Talib. Abu Talib isn't like Abu Jahl. Abu Talib, he did some good things, and even though he didn't die with faith, but he did some good things in the Prophet's life. And the Najashi, in that time when the Prophet said those words, he was a Christian, and he was still a Christian, until he became a Muslim later, But when the Prophet said those words about him being just, it was when he was a Christian. And so the Sahaba found themselves in this new land with this Christian king. And it didn't mean, number one, that they compromised in their religion in any way. They were still Muslims, Sahaba, the Prophet's family was there, Ruqayya, the Prophet's daughter, was there, Uthman ibn Affan was there, great Sahaba, Zubayr ibn Awam was there, radiallahu an. And then in the second migration, even more great Sahaba came in the second migration, but many stayed for many years. Like I said, 15 years. Some died there, had children there, And so it wasn't. The other thing, of course, we're learning is that there was no sense of we need to rebel, in this new land of Abyssinia if we don't see things to our liking. It was, of course, understood this is a Christian king living and this is his Christian country, but they didn't see it that we would have to rebel, and create some disorder to impose Islam, in that land. They understood that their Prophet ﷺ was in Medina, and that was really the source of where their guidance was coming from. But no instructions came like that. It was more like we're living at peace with this king. And of course, Allah at the end gave guidance to the king of Abyssinia, Ashama, and he became Muslim, and the Prophet prayed for him. And the Prophet came out the morning in Medina and says, a good man has, Rajulun Salih, I think it's the hadith, says, a good man has died today. So let's pray for him. And it meant the king of Abyssinia, Ashama Najashi, and they prayed for him. And they only ever came back to Medina when the Prophet wrote a letter to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib saying, come back now. Now, there's one more thing worthy of mentioning, and that is that there was a time during this time in the migration when there was a revolt against the king Ashama Najashi. People wanted to revolt against other Abyssinian tribes, wanted to take power over him. And so Salama again is speaking, and she's saying that nothing made us more scared than it did on that day, because we thought that, of course, it would jeopardize their safety if he's toppled and somebody else tyrannical comes in place. And they said we were really scared. And they said we discussed amongst ourselves, and we said who would volunteer to go and to cross the Nile on the sea and to see what's happened, who's won the war in the battle. And they said it was Zubayr ibn Awam who volunteered and said, I'd go. Allah be pleased with him. And then he swam across, and he was keeping an eye on seeing what's happening. And then he saw Najashi's forces were victorious. He came back, and Salama said, we were waiting for him to come, and we were so scared, thinking what's going to happen. And when he came and said that the Najashi was victorious, she said, nothing pleased us more ever than on that day when we heard that Najashi's forces were victorious. So different ways of seeing it and reading it. One obvious way of seeing it is the fact that they saw, their safety isn't in jeopardy. They can still remain safe as they were when the Prophet told them to go to Abyssinia anyway. Number two could be that they were hopeful that he would become Muslim, and Najashi could become Muslim. That's another way of seeing it. And number three is because, what does chaos this create? If there's a disorder, chaos, is just going to generate further suffering, disorder, chaos, and that isn't something that they would have liked. They're away from their Prophet, other companions are in Medina, and they're still in Mecca, so These are some of the reasons, some of the lessons that we learn about how that small brigade of Muslims survived as immigrants and as a minority in Abyssinia. The key lessons are that there was no compromise of the religion, nor was there a kind of an assertive, a seeking of despoiling, the status quo, without instruction. They were waiting for the Prophet's instruction. That was their main concern, not to take things in their own hands and spoil the status quo. Number 3, there was a sense of comradeship, companionship amongst the Sahaba is the key thing. And so brotherhood and unity in every situation is very essential. You're seeing now the memes coming from New Zealand of these non-Muslims and how they're showing like compassion and kindness to the Muslims. I was reading, they were saying things like, if anybody needs me to stand outside the mosque to keep safety, to keep watch out, I'll do it for you, I'm here for you. And they're saying anybody passing through this area, and need somebody to go on the bus with, contact me, I'll take you with you. What this does is it shows something. It shows that on the one hand, indifference is quite contagious. It's quite contagious. If somebody's indifferent, that's contagious. But kindness is also contagious. Kindness is also contagious. Peace, goodness is also contagious because we feed off one another, right? And I think that what was essential, even living as a minority, the Sahaba that they had in Abyssinia was very beautiful in the sense that they all stuck together and had a sense of leadership amongst themselves, and they survived, and then they came back, and Khaybar happened, and some people took part in it, and then they were martyred straight away, and so that's a big thing for us. Now, the second thing I wanted to speak about today, in fact, was something very different, and that was concerning the Muslims of Andalus, the Muslims of Islamic Spain. Now, there's many, inshallah, different things we'll look at. That was the first one, but another one is this one, and this is quite a big one because the Muslims were not minority, powerless minority in the beginning when they first arrived in Andalus, 711. You might know the basic narrative structure of that of the conquest of Andalus. 711, Tariq bin Ziyad, Musa ibn Nusayr. Tariq bin Ziyad was the governor of Quetta. Quetta is furthest northwest of present-day Maghreb, and then the furthest northeast present-day Maghreb is a place called is Tangiers on the west, and then Quetta is on the furthest northeast. There was, they say, although history is coming a bit later, 16th century, a lot of these stories emerge, and they say that there was a Christian count called Count Julian of Quetta, and so Quetta is furthest northeast, like I mentioned, of the Maghreb, and he sent his daughter to study in one of the schools of King Roderick. King Roderick was a Visigothic king of Al-Andalus, and when he sent his daughter, they said that the daughter was abused in one of the schools of King Roderick, and this enraged, inflamed, Count Julian, and so he enlisted the support of the Muslimin of North Africa. Musa ibn Nusayr, he was the wali of Africa, and so giving them kind of like assistance in getting safe passage into Al-Andalus. This is kind of one theory. They call the girl, they call it La Savarumia. So some Christians, they have her as a kind of a seductress who went there with ill intent. Others, they have her as a victim, La Savarumia. But in any case, that is quite a very popular information story, it's even in Muslim historical writing chronicles as well. In any case, when the Muslims arrived, this is a key thing. So before we get to the situation where they became a minority that's weakened in the land during the later days, meaning the time of the Spanish Inquisition, it's important to look at the beginning of how it all happened and think about how the Muslims lived at different phases of their very long existence in Al-Andalus, and the different dynasties and different rulers in different lands, but how they survived. This is a key thing for us. And so when they arrived in Al-Andalus, remember that and this is, I think, important also in light of the events in New Zealand, because that, murderer, terrorist, on his gun, one of the names he had was Charles Martel, isn't it? He had the names of all of these people who have killed Muslims before, or who were known for, hatred for Muslims and these things. And I saw, I think it was on the barrel of his gun, it had Charles Martel. Charles Martel was called Charles Martellus. Charles Martel was called Charles Prince of the Franks. He was the de facto ruler of France. And so when the Muslims went through these first initial rulers like As-Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani, that's 721, he launched a raid into France. So they took over Al-Andalus, except the northern areas where you have the mountains of Asturias and Galicia. And what happened is that when the Muslims are going northwards, taking Al-Andalus, from the southern coast, going upwards, there are Visigothic nobility. Now the Visigoths, by the way, the Visigoths had Visigothic kings, okay? They had, like, previous to Roderick, they had ones like going back, let's say, 70, 80 years. One was called Ricared the First, Chintilla. And during that time, they were not Catholics, they were Arians. Now, Arians are not like Catholics. Arians were followers of Arius. Arius was a priest in the Council of Nicaea, and he did not believe Jesus was Allah, didn't believe Jesus was even Son of Allah in a physical sense. He believed Jesus was a creature of Allah. It's very similar to Islamic belief, And so Athanasius in the Council of Nicaea was a Trinitarian, wrote his book called On Trinity, and he was arguing against Arius, and it was Constantine, the emperor, he believed in Athanasius, and that was a belief that kind of fell through. But not all of it, because even the next ruler, Constantius I, became then an Arian, And so it kept changing here, back and forth, And even Constantine, the Catholic ruler now, because he's accepted Catholicism, on his death, he gets baptized by an Arian, So this is kind of changing here and there. But Spain is the largest country in Europe, Spain was Arian. It was not Catholic. And Arians believe Isa alayhi salam is not Allah, nor is he a son of God in a physical sense, but more in a figurative, metaphoric sense, and he's a creature of Allah. And so now when these kings came into power, like Ricared the First, Chintilla, they forced baptism, forced conversion to Catholicism. And so there was a widespread forcing of conversion to Christianity, forced baptism. The Jews, who were the weak minority in Al-Andalus, were persecuted. So Ricared the First, for example, they had forced eating of pork, for the Jews, taking children away from their parents, because they said if the children remain with the parents, they'll be forced into deviant belief like Judaism, and so we must take them out from that and save them, with Jesus and all these things. And so when the Muslims arrived, therefore, many of the Visigoths became Muslim. Many, because they saw, well, that's a bit like similar to what our forefathers were on Arianism. Sounds a bit similar. And so many were quick to embrace Islam. Second to that, they were quite sick of the Visigothic corruption in that land. They were sick of there was a civil war, 710, I think, before the Muslims arrived, 710 or 79. There was a civil war between them. There was bad leadership, bad administration, roads weren't getting fixed, infighting and abuse and all these things. But not all became Muslim. And that's the key point. So what's going to affect later on the way Muslims would figure as a minority is because these Christians, now who ironically were now the minority, Visigothic nobility, they traveled northwards as far north as they could go, and they ended up in the Asturias and in the mountains of Galicia. So Muslims are taking all these territories, Seville, Cordoba, Granada, Toledo, Asija, Jaraz, Arcos, but they're not going all the way to the top because it's mountainous. Muslims were very known for having a very strong cavalry, not always the strongest infantry. And so they're horseback, And if you're horseback and you're going at speed, you have the benefit of speed, and you have that you can travel farther and faster. But if there's mountainous areas, then you're going to struggle, because how are you going to go up the mountains, and how are you going to do it? And so they kind of said, well, leave them be, because there's only a few of them, and what can a few do? Except over time, the few would grow into hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, and that's exactly kind of almost what happened. And so early Muslim rulers like As-Samh Malik al-Khawlani engaged with them. There was a defeat in a very famous battle. The new ruler, Abdurrahman al-Khafiqi, so 721, they'd gone from Spain to France. They set up base in a place called Septimania. Septimania is southeast of France, between the rivers Rhine and rivers Garonne. He set up his base there, called Arbuna, now known as Narbonne. When the Muslims, and when the next ruler came, Abdurrahman al-Khafiqi, he met this man that we discussed right now, Charles Martel, in a very famous battle called the Battle of Tours, or Battle of Poitiers, or Battle of Tours. Now this happened after two previous battles, 721, 730. What had happened is that the Muslim ruler, Abdurrahman ibn Malik al-Khawlani, attacked a place called Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a place where there is a Duke Odo of Aquitaine, and he was the ruler, and he was defeated. And so he went to seek help and assistance from this man called Charles Martel. This guy had his name on his gun. Charles Martel, he says, okay, and he prepares a time to meet the Muslims in battle in the year 732, in the Battle of Tours, or Battle of Poitiers. And when they meet in battle, what had actually happened is that the Franks under Charles Martel chose the scene of the battle, and it was high up, on like a very ascending hill, and there were trees, and the trees provided cover for their infantry, their foot soldiers, and they arranged themselves in what's called a phalanx. Phalanx is like a Greek military kind of structure. It's like a rectangular mass of soldiers. And so Abdurrahman al-Khafiqi, who's on the descent, when he's looking up and there's just seeing like one line of soldiers, but it's not, because it's a rectangular mass of soldiers. And also they had the cover of the trees. And number three was that Abdurrahman al-Khafiqi's soldiers were not prepared for the winter in terms of clothing. And so they would have found it very difficult, and they stalemate for like 6 days, and then it breaks, and then he charges his horse upwards, and they came marching down. They encircled them, a bit like Abu Sufyan in Battle of Uhud, and they defeated them. Now this is celebrated in Christendom as a victory, because Muslims never went further than Tours. This is now Western Europe, right? Like in terms of like France. Because if they took Tours, and then next would be England, and going around, and then Eastern Europe, but they never ever went further than Tours. This is why Charles Martel is on the man's gun, because it's like for him a big victory against Islam. Martel is saying that. However, there were other incursions into France, some even further than Tours, I think. But it didn't stop the campaigning, in that area. Now what happened is that the early period of the Muslims in Al-Andalus was one of some degree of stability, but also some instability, because they had very frequent succession of rulers. They would take a place and appoint a wali, then move on a wali, and then they kept changing. And second to that, there was some fear of division, because Muslims were settling in their own areas, the Syrians, the Berbers, the Arabs, in their own pockets of areas, and this became also in time a cause of some division, between the Muslims. And then what happened, of course, is that you had the Abbasid revolution in 750. This was very terrible, because the Abbasids took power in Damascus. It was a bloodbath, a massacre of the Muslims, of the Umayyad family. And in taking power, they then there was one young prince, Abdurrahman I, who had to escape, and in escaping he went through the Sinai, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and he ended up in Morocco 5 years later in 755, And then he was given safe passage, sent his ex-slave Badr to go there, and he was given safe passage into Al-Andalus, and then it became the first real Umayyad rule of Al-Andalus, Abdurrahman I. And then he began the building program of Al-Andalus. So if you've been to Umayyad Mosque, it's not the Umayyad, the Mosque of Qurtuba, the Mosque of Qurtuba, the Grand Mosque of Qurtuba, it's called the Mezquita now. They don't let you pray there if you go there, The first time I went there, so you have to buy tickets to go in. And of course it looks like a mosque. It's 19 aisles perpendicular to the mihrab, the horseshoe aisles, semicircle aisles, 19 of them perpendicular to the mihrab. And so when you go there, then they watch you, and you buy the tickets. So they say, this is not mosque, okay, this is church, okay. So they make sure that they watch you if you're going to pray or not, and they're watching you around. And of course it was Muhammad Iqbal, the very famous Urdu poet, Allama Iqbal, who went and prayed there in 1933. He had a chance to pray. They wrote a very long poem called Masjid al-Qurtuba. One of his lines he says, Didai anjame teri zameen, asmana ke sajo se teri faza bi azan. He said, it's like your earth is like heaven, but it's what a shame that you can't even call azan inside you today. And you do feel that sense of terrible loss when you go there, because it looks like a masjid. It's like a masjid. It just looks like a masjid completely. But it has 2 chapels inside the masjid. Christians go there for mass and for praying and everything. But the beautiful thing is that the mihrab is still there, preserved. People go, tourists, they go and see it. But in any case, it was one of the landmark sites. Al-Idrisi, in his time, he said there was no masjid in the world more beautiful than the Masjid Qurtuba. And they built other things. Like they had in Seville, it's now called the Giralda. It was the Grand Mosque of Seville, and the minaret is 115 meters high. It was the tallest minaret in the world at that time. Now it's the Grand Church of Seville, and it's called the Giralda, which is the tallest thing. It's called the bell tower now. But these were the first things. And so then after that, the second phase was under Abdurrahman II, and then there was a lot of nuisance by Christians, because Christians wanted to do martyrdom operations, and so they chose to go out publicly in the city centers of Qurtuba and curse Islam, and then they wanted to die for that. So you had a priest called Eulogius. He wrote a treatise for 2 women, Maria and Flora, encouraging them to be martyrs, for the Christian cause. And all of this was happening. Why? Because when Muslims arrived into Al-Andalus, remember, there's still not a full majority, there's still a minority, really, because not everybody has become Muslims. There's still Christians and there's Jews. They've made a treaty called Treaty of Theodomir. This was a son of Musa ibn Nusayr, Abdul Aziz I, made a treaty like modeled on the Treaty of Medina, giving rights and protection, and Treaty of Bayt al-Maqdis, rights to those who are like the Jews, because they kicked them out, he brought them back in, giving rights to Christians, allowing them to have their acts of worship and their crucifixes and everything else, to create that sense of justice and stability and harmony, in that land. But when Abdurrahman II came into power, there was a small uprising of these revolts, and they didn't know what to do, because they're choosing to be martyrs. And so the plan was therefore not to kill them, but to take away some of their dhimmi rights. Even though at this time they still allowed them to for the funerals to pass through the streets of Qurtuba, or to have their bells rung on Sundays, they still allowed that to happen. But once they stopped their dhimmi rights, other ones, then these martyrdoms, they stopped, But Abdurrahman III was the most illustrious of these Muslim rulers, because he transformed Qurtuba into what's called convivencia. And convivencia means coexistence, in Spanish. And that's because Muslims, Jews and Christians, they function together. And as you know, there's many things you might know about the scientists and the luminaries and the artists and all these things. And there was, in some respects, some quite good things in that time under his rule specifically, even though there was some israf, there was some going to an excess, where you have like, there's a point where what's artistic could become indulgence. You could turn something artistic into something that's just symbolic of a person's indulgence. And this also began to happen. Now I don't know how long I have to speak, but is there a cut-off point? 9? 30. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I just thought I'd give a backdrop to what's happening, because to understand, Andalus is not like Abyssinia. It's not like 100 people and Sahaba there. It's the whole country. So what happened in the Spanish Inquisition, the dark days, and you'll realize, Allahu Akbar, how the Muslims had to survive as Muslims. We think we have it hard sometimes, but when we go through the accounts of the Inquisition, you realize how difficult it was for them. But this is a backdrop, this is a context. This is like when you had the martyrdom operation of Uthman the second time, one of the reasons was because you had the rise of Mozarabs. Mozarabs were called Musta'arribin. These were Spanish people, Christians, who liked to look like Arabs. Musta'arribin. They wanted to be like Arabs. They wanted to dress like Arabs, speak like Arabic. They learned Arabic language. They used to eat like Arabs. They used to eat on the floor like Arab. They wanted just to be like Arab, but they were still Christians. So Alvaro was a very famous Christian priest. He said a very famous a line, and he says, if you call today, and he says, if you call like the Latin boys, like the Christian boys today, and he said, come and write a sentence of Latin, you wouldn't get even one that could write respectable letter in that language of Latin, their own language. But if you call them to say, come and write a word of Arabic, you'd find throngs and throngs coming to write in the respective language of Arabic. There was therefore a great degree of fascination with the Arabic language, and they became known as the Mozarabs. Now this continued through really until the Inquisition time. Therefore, that means something. It means that the native population of Al-Andalus were quite well acquainted with Arabic sources, with Qur'an, with hadith, books of seerah, fiqh, Qur'an. That means they had some knowledge of this. So when Abdurrahman III is building libraries, he built grand libraries in Qurtuba. You had 300 libraries in Qurtuba. 300. You had 600 masajid in Qurtuba. 50 hospitals in Qurtuba. You had 10,000 lighted cities called the illuminated city of Qurtuba. And this is like the dark ages of Western Europe, and they're struggling with things, and Muslims are learning sciences and all these. And you have great scholars passing through: Imam al-Qurtubi, Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn al-Baytar, all these great scholars, Ibn Jubair al-Andalusi, the traveler. A lot of learning is happening, interchange of knowledge and everything. But it came with its setbacks, its drawbacks. So you have, maybe I'll end inshallah on this. But as Abdurrahman III is now building this grand city of Qurtuba, he builds another city at the same time called Madinatul Zahra, the resplendent city, just outside of Qurtuba. And this was a city which was a symbol to show the Western world, people from Byzantium and Constantinople and Rome, that this is what the Muslims have achieved in this great land. And this city of Madinatul Zahra was so amazing. It had like wild zoo, ostriches, elephants, lions, tigers, in the zoo, bronze and gold and all of these water fountains and all of this stuff where they're supposed to look splendid, just to show the diplomats being sent. His diplomat was a Jewish man called Hasdai ibn Shaprut, and he would use him to bring in these other diplomats from these Western areas to see this is the splendor of Islam in Al-Andalus. But it was an excess. It was an excess, So the artistry becomes excessive. And that's was one of the sparks of the downfall, I think, because now if you go to Al-Andalus and they've made a really big, beautiful museum, And they, you know what happened? So the Muslim infighting that happened after this great period of progress, infighting and division, other Muslims came from the Maghrib, the Muwahhidun, and they destroyed the city because they said this is excessive. You know, this is like you're going to an excess. You know, we have to destroy it because Allah won't be happy. They destroyed all of it. And then it remained buried in the earth until the year 1910, where excavations began. And now they've excavated 10% of the city. It's this humongous stretch of land, untouched, but 10% is excavated. You see the amazing things in it, you know. And so Ar-Rundi, at the fall of Seville, 1248, wrote a poem, and he said, لكل شيء إذا ما تم نقصان فلا تغر بالطيب العيش إنسان وأين ملوك ذوي التيجان من يمن وأين منهم أكلين وتيجان وأين ما حازوا قارون من ذهب وأين عاد وثمود وقحطان وأين قرطبة دار العلوم وكم من عالم قد سما فيها لها شان أتى إلى الكل أمر لا مرد له حتى قضوا فكأن القوم ما كانوا. He says, where are the kings like of the past? You know, where's Qarun and all of his treasures? You know, where is Ad and Thamud and Qahtan? Where's Qurtuba, the land of learning? How many scholars passed through it? He says, upon all of them came an affair they could not return from, meaning death, until they passed, and it was as if they didn't exist in the first place. And so when you look at Madinah Zahra and you think, that was the great grand city and it's nothing, you know, and that's just as a reminder that this is life, you know, that we will pass, and it's as if people won't even know who you were, what your name was, who you were, you know, and time of course does that. And so when Abdurrahman III died, you see his son Al-Hakam I, he launched these raids against the Christians of the north, lots and lots and lots of raids. But what happened is that there were some things that really antagonized the Christians. One of them was in the year 997. What happened was that the Ibn Abi Amr al-Mansur, who was a de facto ruler now by this time, this is in the 10th century, 997, 990s, he would launch these raids, but he launched one raid in a place called the Santiago de Compostela. And Christians believe that's the place that's housing the remains of Saint James. James, they say, the apostle of Jesus. And so he launches this raid, and then he destroys it, maybe unknowingly, and he takes the bells of the church and takes them on donkey to the Grand Mosque of Qurtuba to be used in the bells, no, in the lamps of that masjid, you know. And it was seen as an outrage. And so the symbolic figure of James became transformed into James Matamoros, James the slayer of the Moors. Moors are the Muslims, you know. And so he's now used as a symbol of resistance. Remember, at the same time, what's going to happen in 100 years is the Crusades are going to begin. And so the Crusades, when they start, France is above Spain. And so the Crusade is launched from France, 1095, Pope Urban II, and Spain becomes the theatre of crusading. The Spaniards never went down to help capture Jerusalem for the Christians. They were told by Urban II in 1089, even before 1089, to remain in Spain. In fact, he said, whoever defends the church of Zaragoza or Tarragona will have the same rewards, meaning forgiveness of sins and penance and everything else. And so they thought that they didn't have to do it, they just have to remain, like we believe in ribat. For them it's like ribat, standing foot in the ground, and just prevent the Muslims from taking more of the country, and that's your crusade. And so they're really emboldened by the rise of Christianity, you know, at that time. And then when Bayt al-Maqdis is taken from the Muslims, 1099, Jerusalem, it further emboldens them that now they have a great attempt at power. And that's really the time where the Muslims are scoring so many own goals, you know. And from having a position of power, they became weakened, you know, and they're becoming now that minority. Because the Christian world, like the Christians of the north and the mountains of Asturias Galicia, have grown in size and power. The Catholic Church is supporting them, you know. And Muslims who are in these centers like Qurtuba and Seville have autonomous rulers. That means that they are their own rulers. That means they have their own armies. It means there's no one standing army. Each one is an enemy to the other one. The Christians take notice of this division and they play one against the other. And how many lessons should we learn? I think Andalus is really one of the biggest lessons for us as Muslims about division. There is weakness in division. We're weak when we're divided. And the Prophet says division is adhab in the hadith. He said division is punishment. And unity is rahmah, he says in the hadith. The same hadith, And it's mercy. And so in togetherness, there's minds come together, affairs come together. We should not think that unity means uniformity. There's some people, they think that to be united, you have to be uniform. Like dress in the same uniform. And that's this uniformity. But Islam has never, ever, ever, in its history, from the times of the Prophet's companions, ever understood like that. Unity is not uniformity. And so what you have in Al-Andalus, therefore, is that you had the beginning of division. And it became so divisive that the Christians people were paying tributes to Christian rulers to protect them from invading their lands, to defend them against other Muslims. Crazy things are happening. And this is all the effects of division and divisiveness. We need a lot more of unity, a lot more of understanding between Muslims, a lot more of mercy and compassion between Muslims. Never be belligerent and hard-hearted and cruel and vociferous. That's not mercy. That's not Islam. Islam isn't like that. Islam is a deen of rahmah, a deen of compassion. Look at the Prophet's companions, how they had mercy, Allahu Akbar, for one another. We have to have that in our communities, because otherwise they'll just play us against one another, and this is what they're doing. They play us against each other, and we can't see sense, because we're not studying history to see it's already been done before. I sometimes think that because Spain is like one of the only places in the world where Islam was established in full and removed in full. Can you imagine? Whole country was established Islam. You had Khalif there, Khilafah there, science, scholars, learning everything, and it's removed in full. Like in full, where Islam now becomes a crime to even say Allah. If you said Allah, you could face execution. And the Prophet says there's going to come a time people would say Allah, Allah, that'd be enough for them. And you'll learn to see that more, inshallah, next week in the Inquisition period, But this is what happened, and so the Christians use these things like what happened in Santiago de Compostela. In fact, when the Christians took Al-Andalus, in Granada, so what's happened is that they're losing these states. They lost Seville 1248, Qur'an 1261, I think. They're losing, being expelled from centers like Arcos, 100,000 immigrants, and they're all going to Granada. So Granada is becoming this enclave of the Muslims. They're all going to this one city, Granada, right? Because they're losing they lost Seville, lost Toledo, they lost all these places, and they end up in Granada. And they build Granada, and they expand Granada, and they make a really beautiful city, and they keep it for themselves. They protect it for 100 years. They had to take borough by borough, like village by village, the Christians, to take Granada, and it took them more than 100 years to do that, But when they did, and the Muslims were forced, then you might know the famous story of Abu Abdullah Kulimbo Abdil, and even he had friction with his family. This is why they couldn't agree, because Abu Abdullah had struggled with his father, isn't it? It was his father and the son. And then the son and the wife, it was the son and the mother. So it's even in that there wasn't a united effort against the Crusaders, Ferdinand, Isabella. And when they took power, they came with the flags of the Santiago. It's like, again, like symbolism. It's like, like we're doing to you, like we're coming back like this, And then you have the famous occasion when Abu Abdullah, when he's leaving now in Spain, if you're there, in Granada, there is a road sign. And it's called, in Spanish it says, translated, it says the Moors last sigh. The Moors, Muslims' last sigh. And that's the place they say where Abu Abdullah looked back and he saw them coming in and he's now out. And he began to weep, and his mother said to him, Tabki kan nisa mulkan lam tudafi anhu kar rijal. Cry like a woman for land you couldn't defend like a man. That's why they call it the Moors' last sigh, And so it's very sad. But then, of course, began another period, and this is where they really became the minority. Who were faced the most severe repression and oppression in that time. Very, very, very sadistic tortures of, trying to prevent them from becoming Muslims. You'll realize, inshallah, next week we'll look at the way that they practice Islam in secret. How they had to make wudu in secret. What was their wudu? They had a new fiqh for their time. Ahmad ibn Bujuma from Algeria gave them fatwa that they have to now change. They had their own fiqh, for that minority situation. Because everything was illegal. Everything. Like saying Allah, Arabic was forbidden, Islamic dress was forbidden, eating food on the floor, checking your nails, are your nails cut? All these were points of inquisition from Nicholas Emerick wrote a book called Directorium Inquisitorium, the guide for the Inquisitor. So he had all of these things of ways of finding out if who's a Muslim or not, and then that's a big thing for us to realize about how do we survive, in times of real challenges like those, and to protect yourself and protect your children, that they hold on to Islam. May Allah grant all of us tawfiq. Jazakumullah khairan. جزاك الله خير.